Maybe you can explain, I mean, I think maybe the younger group here, in a funny way, have no recollection necessarily of what that nuance is of the experimentation, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. You mentioned May 68 as sort
Mm-hmm.
of this revolutionary
Right.
experience historically,
Right.
and that's very interesting to see that as qualifying into the architecture itself.
Right.
And so I'd be very curious to know what about your own work, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
tapped that experimental character
Mm-hmm.
at that time period,
Mm-hmm.
and also what was going on necessarily at SCI-Arc that made it so revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something very antithetical to what you described going on, maybe not entirely at Harvard, because obviously you were
Mm-hmm.
taught there and,
Mm-hmm.
and at Columbia teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some nuance or some interest that was going on at that time period
Mm-hmm.
that you saw happening at SCI-Arc, developing here in California. And I was wondering if you can maybe even talk about your work in terms of that.
I think the East Coast, when I was in GSD and even in New York, was largely it was a conservative time. That was the rise of the kind of corporate postmodernism and a return to humanism and let's kill abstraction and so forth. And even when I was in New York, there were just a few people um, doing sort of independent work, including older generation people like Lebbeus Woods, who at that time was in his mid-40s. I was in my mid-20s. Lebbeus, Michael Webb from Archigram and so forth. And then there were, a few other people around like Jesse Reiser and Stan Allen and myself from a generation who've obviously kind of pushed on. But in New York, it was the art scene and the music scene that was vital, and the architecture scene was super conservative and corporate. So I found myself hanging out more with musicians and artists, and I started a band and the whole thing because there was no real vitality or energy in that discourse. Columbia for me was they were so desperate to just have anybody who wasn't um, practicing a kind of conservative project to kind of come in. So California kind of arriving here, just in the mythology of it all, it just seemed like, okay, well, this is where it's happening. And it truly was, I would say, that the kind of intellectual project of Peter Eisenman, which was and still is, the most interesting and kind of dominant discourse in terms of, let's say, the history of ideas in the last quarter of the 20th century, uh, became referenced against the California project of we don't think, we build. A kind of aggressive but self-effacing idea of we're too busy making things. We have the DIY aesthetic. We're in our garages building things. We're going to weld steel up. And I was actually the curious person because I didn't come to California to buy into that. I didn't come and get a garage and start welding. In some respects, I was personally sort of still like a super intricate, disciplined, person who drew, and things were they were searching for a kind of expression and intensity that existed here in California. But I was probably more influenced by, let's say, um, the work of the '60s and the kind of spectacle project like Archigram or structural expressionism, rather than the tiny project which was radical because it was executed. In other words, if you could build a backyard renovation, then that was an intense moment of transformation. For me, I was still in the realm of let's say thinking about things on a bigger scale, and that was connected to my philosophies about technology at the time, which was a dominant thing for me. Tom Main was more dead tech, and I was sort of more NASA, right? What's the leading edge of technology? And I probably had as much alignment with, let's say, British high tech, even though I'm not a follower per se. Um, so for me personally, like the coming to LA, everybody looked at me as a New York architect. I didn't work for Frank Gehry. I didn't work for Tom. I didn't have a mentor out here, and I wasn't born and kind of developed. And I immigrated, right, from New York. So I've always had that kind of. Now an LA architect, but I also get to slightly live in exile, from New York in a way, because that's a time that was really important for me in terms of not only developing ideas, but probably developing identity about myself. Yeah.